Historians of the future may very well refer to our present era as the years of protest and dissent. Certainly, public demonstrations for and against every conceivable cause under the sun have become a prominent feature of the American scene. Whether this phenomenon is good or bad is not within the scope of this discussion. Our purpose today is simply to review the legal restrictions on unbridled speech and protestations of dissent, insofar as they apply to members of the military. There is no denying the fact that a few members of the military establishment have been caught up in the fever of the times and have participated in public political demonstrations. They have become involved in the publication and distribution of so-called underground newspapers, and they have signed and circulated petitions denouncing their commander-in-chief's policies in Vietnam. Upon reflection, we realize that it would be most remarkable if this had not occurred, because, after all, our armed forces are simply a cross-section of the American public, with our fair share of the public's prejudices, passions, and political predilections. Nevertheless, the American serviceman is not quite as free as his civilian brother to flaunt his disagreement with our country's political leaders. This does not mean that the military man is a second-class citizen, but it does reflect our country's long-standing tradition of subordination of the military to its civilian political leaders. History has recorded tragic consequences in countries where the military, after acquiring a taste for political influence, eventually controlled or replaced the civilian government. Partly to ensure that this does not happen in the United States, there are a number of laws and regulations concerning the participation of military personnel in political activities or in public demonstrations of dissent and protest. In order that no military member of this command, through ignorance or misunderstanding, should find himself in violation of these laws and regulations, this briefing will outline them for you in rather general terms. There aren't many, and they're not complicated. They all make sense, their constitutionality has been tested in the courts, and perhaps most important, they are being scrupulously observed by the overwhelming majority of American servicemen. Our federal Constitution guarantees to all Americans the right to freedom of speech, but this is not an absolute license, and there are several federal criminal statutes which, quite constitutionally, designate certain types of speech as criminal acts. Section 1381 of Title 18 of the United States Code provides that whoever entices or procures, or attempts to entice or procure any person in the armed forces to desert therefrom, or aids any such person in deserting or attempting to desert, shall be fined not more than $2,000 or imprisoned not more than 3 years, or both. The same chapter and punishments are applicable to a person convicted of harboring or assisting a known deserter. Knowingly or willingly advocating, abetting, advising, or teaching the overthrow of the destruction of the government of the United States or any state by force or violence is prohibited and is punishable by a fine of not more than $20,000 or imprisonment for more than 20 years, or both. This statute is violated by the publication, circulation, and or distribution of matter advocating the forcible overthrow of the government, as well as organizing a society for that purpose, and the same punishment is applicable. Section 2387 of the same title provides for a $10,000 fine or 10 years in imprisonment, or both, for whoever with intent to interfere with, impair, or influence the loyalty, morale, or discipline of the military, advises, counsels, urges, or attempts to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty by any member of the military. Distribution of offensive literature with the same intent is also a violation. The statute has been held to be applicable in peacetime as well as when a state of war exists. Additionally, willfully making of false reports or statements with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military, or to promote the success of enemies of the United States during wartime, is punishable by a fine of $10,000 and or imprisonment for 20 years. Same punishments are applicable to causing or attempting to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the armed forces when the United States is at war. These wartime provisions are presently applicable by virtue of Chapter 18, United States Code, Section 2391. Finally, any person who knowingly counsels, aids, or abets another to refuse or evade registration or service in the armed forces shall be punished by imprisonment for not more than 5 years or a fine of more than $10,000 or both. The United States Supreme Court has sustained the validity of these statutes against assertion that they violate the right to free speech guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The court has held that freedom of speech is not an absolute right above and beyond the control of Congress. It has said that certain kinds of speech are so undesirable as to warrant criminal sanction. Whether a particular statement falls within the scope of the criminal statute would depend upon careful evaluation of the facts and circumstances of the specific case. Although federal criminal statutes just cited are applicable to everyone, civilian as well as military, there are other laws in this field that are applicable only to military personnel on active duty. For example, Article 117 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice makes punishable by confinement at hard labor and forfeiture of 2/3 pay per month for up to 3 months the use of provoking words or gestures which tend to induce breaches of the peace towards another person subject to the code. Solicitation of desertion, mutiny, sedition, or misbehavior before the enemy in violation of Article 82 may result in punishment if the offense solicited was attempted or completed. Disrespect toward a superior commissioned officer is made punishable by Article 89 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and may be punished by a bad conduct discharge and confinement at hard labor for 6 months. The disrespect may consist of acts or language and may refer to the superior as an officer or private individual. Similarly, Article 91 provides that any warrant officer or enlisted member who treats with contempt or is disrespectful toward a non-commissioned officer while that officer is in the execution of his office may be sentenced by court-martial to bad conduct discharge and confinement at hard labor for 6 months. Conviction for rioting may bring confinement for 10 years and a dishonorable discharge, while breaching the peace may bring confinement and forfeitures for up to 6 months. Willfully disobeying a lawful command of a superior commissioned officer, Article 90, may be punished by a dishonorable discharge and confinement at hard labor for 5 years. Any assault is, of course, punishable under Article 128 of the Uniform Code, with maximum sentences varying with the gravity of the offense. It is interesting to note that you may be guilty of the offense of assault without ever touching the person of another. Finally, Article 134, the general article, provides punishment for communicating threats, uttering disloyal statements, and being disorderly in station. There is also one article of the Code which is directed, interestingly enough, specifically to commissioned officers. Article 88 makes it a crime for any officer to use contemptuous words against the President, the Vice President, Congress, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of a military department, the Secretary of the Treasury, or the Governor of any state or possession in which he is on duty. An officer convicted of this offense by a general court-martial faces dismissal from the service, total forfeitures, and confinement at hard labor for 3 years. The United States Courts of Military Appeals has upheld such a conviction in the case of an Army lieutenant who had participated in a demonstration while carrying a placard urging "End Johnson's fascist aggression in Vietnam." Although Article 88 is directed to commissioned officers, Article 134 has a similar provision directed toward enlisted personnel. Most military members are generally familiar with the existence of Article 92. This is the article that enforces administrative regulations. Violation of this article is punishable by a dishonorable discharge, total forfeitures, and confinement at hard labor for 2 years. This article is the reason Air Force regulations have the force and effect of law. This being the case, let's look at the administrative regulations governing dissent and protest by members of the Air Force. According to these directives, the distribution of publications through other than official outlets on the base is subject to prior approval by the commander in order that he may determine whether there is a clear danger to the loyalty, discipline, or morale of military personnel, or whether the distribution of the publication would materially interfere with the accomplishment of the military mission. If he makes such a determination, distribution will be prohibited. Commanders have authority to place establishments off limits in accordance with established procedures. When, for example, the activities taking place there include counseling members to refuse to perform duty or to desert, or involve acts with significant adverse effect on members' health, morale, or welfare. Commanders are not authorized to recognize or bargain with so-called servicemen's unions. Personal writing for publication may not be pursued during duty hours or accomplished by the use of government or non-appropriated fund property. While publication of underground newspapers by military personnel off-post, on their own time, and with their own money and equipment is not prohibited, if such publication contains unlawful language, those involved in the printing, publication, or distribution may be disciplined for such infractions. Any demonstration or activity on the installation which could result in interference with or prevention of orderly accomplishment of the mission of the installation is prohibited. Members of the armed forces are prohibited from participating in off-post demonstrations when they are on duty or in a foreign country, or when their activities constitute a breach of law and order. Well, there it is in a nutshell. We in the military are restricted to some degree in making public statements, in taking part in political activities, and in publicly dissenting from the policies of our Commander-in-Chief, the President. Some may feel this is unfair, but far wiser men than we, including the drafters of our Constitution, recognize the perils of military involvement in politics. Whether we agree with these restrictions is not important. I can assure you that they are legal, and I submit to you that the interests of our nation are best served by disciplined military forces completely responsive to the will of our duly elected civilian leadership. As long as we are on active duty, we're subject to military law, a law which also has its foundation in the Constitution. With this in mind, and in view of the restrictions we've been discussing, it would be a rash person indeed who would deliberately try to test the system. My advice to military personnel who might be dissatisfied with their lot in life is to see if they can't resolve their problems by using established procedures within the Air Force. If you have a conflict, present your problem or your grievance to your supervisor, your first sergeant, or your commander. If you're not satisfied, see the Inspector General. If you're still not satisfied, you're always free to present your grievances to your representatives in the Congress. As an American citizen, you may with impunity hold private beliefs that are violently anti-administration in all respects. It's just the public demonstration of your beliefs and political views that is limited by your status as a member of the military. Neither time nor our facilities here permit a question and answer period. I think, however, that we've covered all of the essential points on this subject. I would urge anyone who feels a need for more detailed information to get in touch with the base staff judge advocate. By all means, don't blunder into trouble with the law simply because you neglected to find out everything you need to know on this subject.